Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another top 10 player of all time ranking here, one that I did promise to do a while back. And here I'll be redoing my top 10 players of all time for Australian Survivor. Now I am doing this video after Heroes versus Villains, where it's been 3 seasons since the last time I did this ranking, which really isn't that much. And considering my later plans to do a larger scaled ranking for Australian Survivor at some point down the road, I did question if this list was absolutely necessary to redo here. However, I do feel like there are so many changes to the list since the last time I've done it, with, again, 3 seasons of new players to be added to the list. Also, some returnees in the bunch there, and also just in general, my opinions on certain players changing over time. It ends up being a very different list from the last time I did it. Only 5 of the 10 players in my top 10 last time are still on the list. And again, there are placement changes within those players as well. So again, there will be a number of changes to the list here. And again, this is going to be a ranking based on how likely I feel like these players are to win on any given season. But before we get to the actual list, let's talk about the honorable mentions, where first we'll talk about the 5 players from my previous list that didn't make it onto the list this time, and also talk about players from the more recent seasons that I considered though didn't make it on. So first we'll talk about those on the previous list in reverse order of where they were on that list, where the first person to talk about here is Matt Rogers. And I mean, this one's not that big of a surprise. Again, he was number 10 last time. He's really just barely on the list. And to be fair, I don't even know if I necessarily agree that he should have even been number 10 last time. So again, not a big shock that he didn't make it this time, though realistically my opinions on his game haven't really changed that much. The next one here is a big shocker. This is one that I came in to the prep for this video fully expecting this person to easily crack the top 10, and not just the top 10, but maybe even top 5. However, the more and more I thought through this list, which I will say I did go through numerous iterations of this list, I just felt like I could not justify putting this player above certain other players that do make the top 10, and that person's Shawnee. And again, I really thought her run on Heroes vs. Villains was enough to really elevate her on the list. And to be fair, she is higher technically than what she was last time. Again, I had her 9th last time, and considering the number of new players that were added to the list, she is technically higher in my estimations than some of the players that we'll be talking about in a second that also didn't make it onto the list. However, I just feel like Shawnee is a player that, I'll be honest, I just don't have that much faith in. Like, even though she has shown some consistency now, she's gotten a 4th place finish, a 7th place finish, a 9th place finish. And I think her Heroes vs. Villains game was probably the most impressive of her games, to where she really ran the game alongside George up until her eventual boot. I think that run also showed me a lot of the glaring issues in her game. Her still lacking strategically and not having the greatest reads at points. But even beyond that, I think when looking back at her All-Stars game, like, she was supposed to be a pre-merge boot there. She gets saved by a non-limb. And really, she never truly had a path to the end on really any of her seasons. And because I just really don't have much faith in Shawnee to actually get to the end and actually win on any given season. So despite this level of consistency of her getting to the merge on all 3 appearances, even that isn't fully solidified considering she wasn't supposed to her second time around, and I just don't think she can actually get to the end on any appearance. So sadly, she ended up just barely missing the list. I mean, she was pretty much number 11. But beyond that, I mean, also Benji, who was number 8 last time, is on the list this time. Not that big of a surprise here. Again, kind of like Matt Rogers, there were just more people added. My opinion on Benji hasn't really changed, though, with the fact that he hasn't played again and his initial game in itself being pretty messy. I do feel like it's tough to justify putting him on a list at this point. Next up here, this person was number 7 last time I did this list. Or this one was definitely a lot more in consideration. That person is Harry, and I think Harry's pretty much number 12. I still very much hold Harry in high regard here. I do think his first time playing, and while very messy, at least did make it very far into the game, one challenge away from winning the game, and for him to come into his second season with a massive target on his back and still somehow squeeze his way into the merge with almost half of the players in the game on his side, I feel like that is still very impressive. Again, I did very much consider putting Harry on the list, but he barely missed out on that. And the last person that was on my previous list that isn't on it now is a player that I have dropped so much in my estimations since the previous list, where this person was literally number 10 2, the last time I did a top 10 player ranking. However, I think hearing certain exit interviews about him and also just reassessing his game as a whole, I have largely went down on this player, and that person is Jericho. And again, Jericho for me, again, has a very messy winning game. Obviously, it's one where, yes, he's able to recover from the mistakes that he makes in a way that the likes of like Luke and Sarah are not able to. He still does make plenty of rash moves on that season that do get him in the hot water. And really, if it was not for the fact that he had this really strong bond with Tara that saves him in the end game and allowed him to get into fire making, he wouldn't have had that much of a path to the end either. However, again, his game in season 2 is still solid and enough to where if it was only that, he probably still would have cracked the top 10. However, something that's always sticked out to my mind is hearing the stories from All-Stars, where listening to David's deep dive after All-Stars, where he talks about how much he wanted to work with Jericho, that they had this connection due to their friendship with Luke, only for Jericho to completely shut him down. And that is what caused David to be targeting Jericho. Like, that's all really bad. That's pretty much the main reason why I've completely written off Jericho off of this top 10 here, is because, again, like, his first game in itself is already like very rocky, or the fact that he makes that major of a mistake his second time around. And while yes, you could say, okay, he had to target being a former winner, it doesn't feel like that's actually the reason why he was actually voted out there. And really, at this point, he's a player that I don't have that much faith in on any given season, so he didn't make the top 10 either. So again, that's the people that were on the list last time, didn't make it on this time, but we still got to run through our mentions from the following seasons as well. Now, from Brain vs. Brawn, truth be told, again, it's a very lackluster cast gameplay-wise there, with obviously 2 major standouts that are both in the top 10. However, the only honorable mention I'll be talking about here is Flick, who has now played twice, getting a 3rd place finish in a position where she was 1 vote away from winning the game. And her second time around, again, while not nearly as strong, did at least have 1 really good moment in convincing Liz and Shawnee to keep her around. So again, I don't think she's an entirely bad player, but again, not really that close to making the top 10 here. Now for Blood vs. Water, we have some considerations. First of which being Nina, who obviously would play again in Heroes vs. Villains, obviously a 2-time player now. And again, Nina is a very solid player. I think she's a solid all-around player. Made it very deep in Heroes vs. Villains. Only a few rounds away from winning the game if she was able to take out George. And that's the thing, she completely failed at taking out George throughout the entire post-merge phase of the game, though also did do some good work in working alongside him at points as well. And considering her first appearance as well, where she seemed on track to have a very deep run on that season as well. Again, like, I do feel like Nina is definitely deeply in consideration for this list, but I didn't quite squeeze her on. The next player is someone that I really wanted to put on the list, as I do feel like this is a player that I probably have more faith in than a few of the players that are on the actual list, though it would be weird to have this person in the top 10 considering their placements, and that person is Sam. Now, Sam obviously, again, was a pre-merge boot her first time around, came back, was 8th place, and because I would feel very strange to have this person being in the top 10 amongst the greats, though I do think Sam is actually a really solid player, especially if we're talking about modern day Sam that has learned the game, and Sam that would be able to play on her own, not playing a game where she's trying to give Mark the win instead. And I do feel like there is so much potential in Sam as a player to where I very much want to put her on the list, as I do feel like out of all the players in Australian Survivor, I think she's probably one of the people that I have the most faith in their overall strategic ability and their reads in the game. But again, it is those lower placements that make it a bit tougher to justify putting her on. Next up, another person that, again, wasn't really that close to being in consideration, but I at least want to mention Jordy, who, again, like, played a versatile game his first time around. Again, very messy, where he was on the bottom for a while, but also, like, squeezed on by for a bit. Again, obviously, non-eliminations helped him, but still made the final 6 with a lot of win equity there, and then came back and played a decently impressive game for a pre-merge boot on Heroes vs. Villains. Torwally obviously makes a big mistake in his boot round. I do feel like he plays a solid game there. Like, to me, he's essentially a better version of Benji at this point in terms of where I would assess him, but again, still didn't quite make it onto the top 10. And the final person from Blood vs. Water I consider that didn't make the list is Chrissy, who I do think is a very high variance player. I think she's a person that could be a very early boot on most given seasons, but I do think if she makes it far, she's almost guaranteed to make it to the end. And to be honest, if that was only the case, then she would not be really in consideration here. However, what does put her in consideration is the fact that she had a very likely win scenario by the end game, where if she had gotten to the final 3 with the likes of KJ and Shay, she would have probably won the game. Obviously, she doesn't take that path, and to be fair, on that season in particular, it would have been tough to actually get to that idealistic final 3, but it is because that path was still open, her being pretty much guaranteed to make it to the very end for a good chunk of that game. I at least had to consider her here. And finally, we have to talk about heroes versus villains, the latest season, where first person we'll be talking about here is someone that was actually a returnee on the season, though his game on this season did elevate him a bit, and that person is Sean, where again, he didn't make it onto the actual list. I do think he improved his game on heroes versus villains, where he was able to lessen his threat level come into the merge, to where he wasn't immediately a boot, and even then gets voted out in kind of a fluky situation. I do think if he made it towards the end game, he would have been this likable underdog, though at the same time, it's not really a position where he was that close to making the list, but still definitely a player that went up in my estimations. And then also I gotta mention the finalists from this season, Jerry and Matt, who I guess we'll just talk at once about. And I think they both played pretty solid games here, again, attaching themselves to George, getting their way all the way to the end, and had it been a final 2 as they were anticipating, I do think they would have been in a decent spot to be the final 2, where Matt in particular probably would have won that final 2. However, they were both harmed by jury perception, and obviously just get demolished the final tribal, to where again, it's tough to actually put them on the actual top 10, especially with Jerry being a player that I look at as somewhat inconsistent, and Matt having a somewhat rocky path through the game. But with that, we're on to the top 10. The 10 players I think are the most likely to win on any given season. And at number 10, we're starting off with a person who was much higher the last time around. However, this person has dropped in my estimations quite a bit, to where, again, I debated not having this person in the top 10 anymore. But at number 10, I do have Pia from Championship Contenders 2, obviously the winner of that season. And again, I had Pia at number 3 last time I did this list. Mind you, again, that was immediately after All-Stars. We only had 5 winners at that point. I do think that greatly factored into why so many winners were so high on that list. However, I do think my opinions of Pia's game have gone down significantly since the last time I did a ranking. I mean, her winning game is one that, while yes, I do think she plays a pretty strong game up until Final 7, is one where, again, she is still potentially in danger very early on, where I do think that leads to some inconsistency in her game, to where I'm not really sure how she would do it on any given season. Which, to be fair, her only one appearance at this point definitely plays a factor into that. But even beyond that, at the Final 7, she's left on the outs for a while, to where she is supposed to be the boot at Final 5 and only gets saved by Luke's advantage. And while yes, I could think you can say that, okay, her relationship with Luke is what got her through that round, I mean, the fact that she had to be saved by Luke in a very fluky situation there is definitely a knock for me. Now again, she does end up cutting both Luke and Harry in the endgame positions where I think both of them would have beaten her, and she gets her ideal situation against Baden in a position where she convinces Baden to keep her around over Harry, who had been working with Baden the entire season. Like, that part of the game is impressive, though again, I still do look at her as a pretty inconsistent player, one that I'm just not sure if she can even make it that far on most given seasons. However, if she does make it to the merge, she's a style of player that should be pretty good. However, I say that, yet on her actual season that she won, she still was left on the outs for a few rounds and was still going to be booted at Final 5 until she got saved. So again, like, I feel like there is a lot to not like here from Pia, to where I think on paper she is kind of the stereotypical Australian Survivor winner of this woman who, if she's able to get to the merge, is not looked at as a big enough threat to be taken out before the end game, and is able to pull out some moves at the very end to eventually lead to their win. Again, Pia fits within that archetype to a degree, though I do feel like there's more inconsistency with her than certain other players in that archetype, to where I just don't feel as confident about Pia. However, again, she did play the last couple rounds pretty well there, and even beyond that, was in a very good position for most of the game. So again, it is enough to land her here at number 10. Now number 9, and this is a player that I very much struggled with as well. This being a player that I did not think was going to make the top 10 when I initially did the prep for this video. However, the more I thought about it, the more it kind of irked me that he wasn't. So at number 9, I do have Josh from Blood vs. Water. And Josh is a player that I remember at the time that the season aired, I was thinking, okay, he's going to border on the top 10. And after seeing Heroes vs. Villains, I was thinking, okay, there's no way he's going to make it on. However, again, like when doing the prep process, I just feel like Josh, especially out of the one-time players, plays one of the most impressive games of Australian Survivor. I mean, he is a player that doesn't fit into the stereotypical Australian Survivor winner, but was able to use that stereotype to his benefit. Again, he is a player that weaponized this aspect of the broy guys usually getting taken out in the early merge phase of the game as these physical threats, and was able to solidify the guys together to where he ends up really dominating a lot of the game. And while that doesn't make for great TV, and he is a major reason why Blood vs. Water is not a good season, I do feel like it is still very impressive gameplay-wise. Now, I do think there are questionable decisions he makes in the game, particularly towards the very end of the game, and did have some poor threat management towards the very end of the game, with him kind of seeming to mismanage his relationship with Chrissy and Shay to where they looked at him as the bigger threat over Mark. Though I still feel like the fact that he ends up playing an extremely dominant game in a show that is typically void of extremely dominant games is still something very impressive to say about Josh here. Where while I'm sure some people will be upset that Josh is on the list here instead of Shawnee, I do genuinely believe that Josh played an incredible game on this season and was really able to utilize the history of the show to his own benefit. That definitely elevates my overall opinions of him as a player, which is why he does land here number 9. Now, number 8, we're talking about a player that I very much struggle with, this player as well. Where straight up, the next 2 people we'll be talking about are 2 people that were very much hovering on the list, as I do think these 2 players are essentially back-to-back in my mind. Both of them having 2 appearances on the show, having the exact same placement on their 2 seasons, and both being really tough players for me to assess, as I do think these are both players that are some of the best well-rounded players in the history of the show, but are also players that I think struggle to get to the tail end. But at number 8, we're going to start off with the player that I think comes off as a bit more threatening, which knocks him a bit down, and that person is Luke. And again, I really just did not know what to do with Luke. I am always so perplexed on where exactly to rank Luke, as at one point in this list, he was as high as number 5. However, then I dropped him down to where he barely even made the top 10, and then now he's kind of hovering around the middle of that. Like for me, Luke is a player that demonstrates a lot of good game ability. I mean, he is a very good social player to where most people out there really love him. He's the type of person that if he gets to the very end of the game, he is more than likely winning every single time. Where not only does he come off as very likable and plays the game hard, but he also has a great story outside the show that really propels him in his jury chances. Though at the same time, that's also why I think it's very unlikely that he actually gets to the end. He's essentially a player that needs to win out every single time he plays, to where I feel like there's so much inherent likability with him that everyone recognizes how big of a threat he is, and I don't think there's any avoiding that for Luke. However, again, I do think he's a very versatile player, and that's kind of why my assessment of him and the next player we'll be talking about was very tough, as I do feel like Luke is a player I would probably have more faith in to get himself out of a very sticky situation, and probably also have more faith in finding advantages in order to help him in that aspect as well, though, again, Luke also just comes off as more blatant of a threat in my mind, and also probably too chaotic of a player to where I could see his own plans backfiring on himself, as we do see in Season 2, where he ends up being on the bottom largely due to his own actions. And then in Season 4, I would say it's less so that, but again, it's just his inherent threat level that really ends up making it tough to truly put him too high on a list in my mind, and because that he is here number 8. And number 7, again, the person I was referring to, same placements, but very different games, and that person is Brooke. And again, there was a point where Brooke wasn't in the top 10. To be honest, Brooke and Shawnee were 2 people that I was looking at as very similarly at one point. However, I think what elevates Brooke is the fact that, again, I do look at Brooke as a better all-around player. I feel like Brooke is the type of player that I would be very shocked if Brooke did not make it deep into the game anytime she plays. I think she is a near perfect representation of the stereotypical good Australian Survivor player. She's a very well-rounded player, being good socially, physically, and decent enough strategically. She seems to be good enough physically and socially to where, again, she should be good enough to squeeze by through the merge. She's never going to be voted out as a physical liability. Also, is probably going to be in the majority alliance on most given tribes. And then when she comes to the merge, she's the type of player that is probably able to surround herself with bigger threats to where they're the initial target. But what I do struggle with Brooke is the fact that, again, I do feel like by the time of the end game, she's always going to be targeted. And we see on Season 1 where she gets blindsided at the final 7 after playing a pretty dominant game on that season. And on All-Stars, she gets targeted by the time of the final 9. to where she gets saved by a non-limb there. And while she is able to win comps to get towards the end, get to 4th place, I just feel like Brooke is another one that would struggle to get to the very end of the game without winning out. And again, I do very much struggle in this debate between Brooke or Luke, where again, I do think Brooke is a more stable presence. I do think Brooke is the player that probably just naturally has a deeper run in her. However, I have more faith in Luke's overall game ability to make his own path through the game. Though also at the same time, I have this worry of Luke messing up his own game for himself. And I think the thing that really decided it for me is the fact that I do think Brooke is probably more likely to be able to squeeze on by than Luke, to where I feel like there's more worlds where Brooke is not looked at as massive of a threat by the end game than Luke, to where I just can't imagine that world for Luke, where at least I can imagine that world for Brooke. So again, it is really that very minute difference there that leaves Brooke above him at number 7. Now number 6, and here we're moving on to a player that I'm surprised they're this high. To where coming into the prep for this video, I was debating if this person would even be top 10, but the fact that they're number 6 is pretty surprising to me, and that person is the latest winner of the show. We do have Liz. And Liz is a player that, again, I talked about in previous videos. I've been very critical of her overall game ability. I do feel like she is a player that had some pretty bad strategic reads in the game and kind of had to be saved by the likes of George and Shawnee at points, to where while she does go out of her way to get her way at points in the game, a lot of those points are situations where those moves aren't even in her best interest. However, outside that, I do look at Liz as a very well-rounded player. I mean, to me, it's like her and Brooke are essentially the same archetype. Again, they are in this traditional Australian survivor winner mold of this very good social and physical woman that's able to make it through a lot of the merge phase, but also still not be looked at as a big enough threat to be taken out right away at the merge. However, I feel like Liz has obviously demonstrated more ability to be able to squeeze her way to the end than Brooke, though obviously, again, there's some flukiness in the fact that she was able to, the fact that she was left out of the vote at points and did get benefited by winning final immunity and also the lack of a final 2, though realistically I do think Liz is still a very well-rounded player. Again, I think she's good physically, where obviously she wins a decent amount of immunity challenges and is not going to be taken out early. She is good socially, to where we see her obviously build a really strong bond with George and Shawnee, but even after the swap, she's able to get in with Nina, David, and Sam despite being essentially screwed initially. And then strategically, again, she does have a level of a killer instinct. Now, again, I wish it was a bit more, but at least she does cut George at the very end, and she did look at the game pretty strategically, even though some of her reads were pretty wrong. But again, I do look at her as a pretty well-rounded player, a player that, again, if she were to play again, I would not be that surprised if she goes on to win again. I mean, to me, she's essentially a better version of Brooke, where, again, while initially I didn't think Liz would be super high on this list, it is because that she's here at number 6. Number 5, and this one was a very weird one here, where this is a player that technically leapfrogs certain players that they were lower than in the previous list, though I think in comparison to the likes of a Liz, a Brooke, and a Luke that we just talked about, I feel like this person is still better, and that person is Sharn. And obviously Sharn's a very tough player to assess, with her being a 2-time Final Tribal loser. She's the only person to make a Final Tribal twice and lose both times, which obviously the fact that she has lost both times would make you think that, oh, she must not be that great. But again, it's also the fact that she made it to the end both times, which shows, one, a level of consistency with her game, but also is a testament to how she maneuvers through the game, where I think something Sharn does extremely well is that she's able to essentially be a chameleon in the game, bond with differing factions, being able to side with the sporty group in the likes of a Matt Rogers and a Moana and a David, but also align with the more nerdier side of things, but also bond with the less alpha side of things, bonding with the Nicks and the Benjis and the Harrys. Like, I do feel like overall Sharn is just a master at playing the middle. Now, I think she overall plays the middle too much, and that does get her in a bit of danger, especially with jury management, but again, I think she has expertly navigated through the game twice now. And while, yes, she is very prone to mistakes, we have seen her, especially her first time around, make some dumb mistakes and letting Matt Rogers go, and her having to play from the bottom for a bit after that, but she's able to recover from that, finding multiple idols and eventually using one successfully. She is able to navigate through the end game alongside Shane to get to a Final Tribal in that season in particular, where she would have won. if jury questioning didn't occur. And while yes, she does fumble the bag at Final Tribal, I don't think that completely demerits her entire game up to that point. And again, All-Stars I do think is a lesser game. And in fact, it never seemed like she was super poised to win that one, though at the same time, she does get to the final 3 with a winning scenario in front of her, or if she wins Final Immunity, she takes Moana and probably wins the game there. So again, I do think there is a lot to praise with Sharn, to where while yes, on paper it seems really bad, the fact that she hasn't won the game despite being at Final Tribal twice, and she does have a somewhat rockier path in Season 3, and also seemed to do a lot of poor jury management through Season 5, I do feel like as a whole, she is still a very solid player, one that I do think is largely consistent, and because of that, for me, she's here number 5. Now, number 4, we're moving on to the most improved player since the previous list. Obviously, with this person having returned since then and gone on to win, at number 4, we do have Mark. And Mark is a player that I do think is a bit tough to assess, largely because obviously he was on Blood vs. Water and he had his wife there that helped him get through the game. However, in many ways, I do look at him and Josh very similarly in terms of their base game ability. However, obviously, Mark outplays Josh to a significant degree. And when, again, listening to the deep dives post-season, I was very impressed with Mark's overall ability to articulate his game and go through his strategic thinking, to where, while, again, there are a couple points here and there where I can point out that Mark probably misplayed a situation, I do think as a whole, Mark played a pretty dominant game, essentially running the game alongside Josh. And while Josh is able to undercut him by taking out Sam, and Mark's in a situation where he needs to play his idol for a round, I think he plays the last couple rounds of that game extremely well, completely tricking KJ into essentially voting herself out of the game, while also following that, convincing Chrissy to finally turn against Josh, who had been her closest ally throughout a lot of the game. And really, just as a whole, I think Mark is an extremely well-rounded player, where again, the biggest criticism of him is the fact that, again, he did win on a season that he had his wife helping him out. Though really, I felt like some of his strongest gameplay was after she had left. And considering, again, I think he also has a lot of the benefits of my opinions of Josh and the fact that he ran a lot of the game. He utilized the history of the show to his advantage and further bonding these bro-y guys together. I feel like Mark plays an extremely impressive game on that season. That is why, despite his early boot his first time around, that doesn't really affect my overall ranking of him, especially considering how much I feel like that was a position where he didn't really know the game at all, to where he did know the game the second time around and played impressively there, and that's why he's here number 4. Now, number 3, and again, these top 3 I think are pretty definitive. I mean, this was never really a doubt in my mind, though the placements here were very rough, where coming into Heroes vs. Villains, I had a definitive top 2. Obviously, leaving Heroes vs. Villains, a third player locked their spot within that 3, and I do think it is very interchangeable between these 3. However, at number 3, I am going to have to leave behind George. And let's just talk about it now. I do think the debate between George and Haley is one that's obviously hotly contested. I do think it is one that I do very much struggle with, in the fact that obviously Haley does eventually go on to beat George on their original season. However, George strangely has the distinction now of having outplayed Haley during each of their seasons. He is the main orchestrator of her vote out her first time around, before she had re-entered the game, and he orchestrated her boot during Heroes vs. Villains as well. So it is kind of a weird spot for George, to where the person that he directly gets beaten by is also the person that he's outplayed in the 2 appearances that they've played together. Also beyond that, Ozzy's George has demonstrated himself to be one of the best strategic players this show has ever seen, also having a very solid social game his second time around, to where his non-winning game in Heroes vs. Villains is one of the all-time greats, having pretty much completely run the game from the Frazier boot on, and really demonstrating a lot of great game ability, demonstrating a lot of really savvy maneuvering through the game, and this great ability to pick up allies and broker deals. And George is for sure up there with the all-time greats. However, I do feel like, despite the fact that we've seen him have one of the highest average placements across all of Survivor, and him getting second place his first time around and fourth place his second time around, I do still worry about the level of consistency with him, where I think he's the type of player that, again, on any given season, I would not be shocked to see him be a relatively early boot. I mean, Brains versus Braun in particular, he was supposed to be the early boot multiple points and get saved due to different advantages he finds or certain other things that were out of his control. And while he's able to recover from that and play a very strong game after that, there is still that worry there. And while again on Here's His Villains, I do think he didn't have as much of that, even though he did skip out in the first tribal. I do feel like a lot of that stems from this concept of the meat shield and people wanting to keep him around as a target for down the road, which that point just never really happened. But I think George is in this position where, again, if he were to come back, I would once again suspect that he would be a relatively early boot. And while this might be misguided in the fact that we just saw this situation happen and he wasn't an early boot, I still have that on my mind. I just really do not think George is actually that consistent of a player, despite the fact that we've seen 2 deep runs from him now. But also beyond that, I think the main sticking point for me with George and the next 2 people we'll be talking about is I feel like I have no faith in George to get to the end in a winning situation. Where George is essentially a player that I think by the time of the end game, he has 2 different paths. He's either someone that isn't particularly liked by the jury to where he's not that likely of a winner, as we saw in Brains vs. Braun, where both Haley and Flick would have beaten him at the end, and through that it was much safer to take him deeper into the game. Or it's the other scenario like Here's His Villains, where he's such a big threat to where no one's going to take him to the end of the game. Either way, I do think his winning scenarios are very limited, where to me it's like he's either going to get to the end with very little win equity, or he's going to be sniped at the very end with a lot of win equity, largely due to the fact that he can't win a competition for himself. While I feel like the top 2 players are players that have a lot more faith to win out at the very end, or I feel like that is a major hole in his game for me, to where I just find it tough to truly have him above the top 2, and I just don't have that much faith in George getting to the end in a position where he can actually win. And because that, for me, he is here number 3, not number 2. And again, the top 2 here are 2 of the most well-rounded players in the history of the show, 2 winning players at that. However, the order here was obviously for debate, though realistically for me, it wasn't that close. And at number 2, I do have Haley. And again, for me, actually, really, Haley was closer to George than she was to the number 1 person in my eyes, to where I think George and Haley, again, is very, very close. To where really, for me, it is, again, this factor of I have more faith in Haley winning out at the end that really propels her to number 2 here over George. Where again, Haley is technically a player that got outplayed by George twice now. And while she's able to recover from that first time around and rebuild her relationship with George and navigate through the game with George, I do still find a lot of fault in the fact that she was voted out her first time around. Now, obviously, there is this factor of like she was screwed over by a twist, where if it wasn't for that very wonky final 12 round, then Haley would not have blown up her relationship with George, to where in the following round, George obviously pins all the votes onto her. I still find the fact that she gets outplayed by George in that situation to be pretty bad. And also beyond that, she is a very versatile player. I think she is a very strong strategic player in the game, though I do think something she lacks is this element of forethought, where I think through both of her seasons now, we've seen her make these moves that end up completely backfiring on her. Making these moves like splitting the vote onto Danny and going out of her way to save Simon and leaking all this information about George, like all these moves that, while good on paper, do have severe ramifications that end up causing to her eventually being voted out. And really, I feel like she's a player that's probably a bit too trigger happy in the game. I think the fact that she was so willing to cut George from so early on seemed extremely misguided, especially considering the fact that, again, George is a player that won't have much ability to actually win the final challenge to get himself to the very end. And to me, it is those faults in her strategic thinking that do really harm my overall opinion of her as a player. As again, on paper, I think she is one of the most well-rounded players in the history of the show. I think she's the type of player that, on Australian Survivor in particular, if you get her to the end game, she is going to win out and she is going to win the game. She's also a player that, again, is very good socially and, again, has a very strong strategic mind for the game, but I do think she just gets a bit ahead of herself and doesn't really think about the ramifications of her moves and how it affects the likes of a Danny and a Nina, to where they end up turning against her because of these moves that she ends up making. But as a whole, again, I think of her as a very strong, well-rounded player, and that is why she's still here at number 2. Now, number 1, the best player of Australian Survivor, is still the same as last time. It is still David. Where again, for me, David's an extremely well-rounded player, one that I think has demonstrated less holes in his game than Haley over his 2 runs, though is still a very flawed player. And really straight up, I don't think any Australian Survivor player really lives up to any of the all-time greats on Survivor US, which is kind of why I've never done a global Survivor top 10 player ranking, largely because I don't think that many Australian Survivor players, or really even Survivor SA players, end up even cracking that list. And David, for me, again, like, while he's number one here, he is still a flawed player. I think he's a player that obviously gets a bit too cocky. I think he came off as a bit domineering his first time around, where obviously the women end up flipping the vote onto him in the post-merge, blindsiding him for the idol in his pocket. Though at the same time, he did play from the bottom pretty well in that season. And the fact that after he got swap screwed, he is able to survive some of those rounds there. So got on him for that. Though, again, in All-Stars, despite it being this widely talked about extremely dominant game, and I do think it is the most dominant winning game that we've seen from Australian Survivor, it's still a very flawed game. I mean, while he does make this relationship with Matt Rogers that seemed to be working very well initially, he does get caught. And while it wasn't on their show, supposedly David was the next to go had they gone to Tribal, with there being a plan to blindside him due to him being caught. And after a swap, he's put into a bad position where his closest ally in Phoebe is even working against him there, though he ends up playing his relationship with Phoebe really poorly in my eyes, where he just kind of comes off as a dick to her, even though she was on her way out. But I think really that ends up burning his relationship with Nick. So while Nick is the next to go, I just really feel like that's suboptimal play there. And post-merge, I mean, again, he does run really the rest of the game outside of the Zach vote, which does show him poorly maintaining the vote of Jackie there, though really he's able to recover from that and does play really from that point on near masterfully. Again, his use of the idol on Tarzan at the final 8 vote, and then forcing the other side to take out Jackie was really strong. His taking out of Tarzan's kind of a mixed bag, and the fact that I get his strategic thinking, though also does leave him more vulnerable towards the end game, and that he wanted to keep the stronger people around to take out Brooke, though it did leave him a bit more vulnerable by the time of the final 3, though he does end up winning that final 3 immunity challenge. Though it is a challenge that he debatably needed, which is kind of a knock there, to where I feel pretty confident Sharon would have caught him. While Moana's a bit more up in the air. Again, I do feel like that is a pretty precarious spot to be in, though one that, again, I fully get why he puts himself in that position. But again, just as a whole, I do think he is still a very well-rounded player. Again, he is obviously good physically, to where he wins those endgame comps to take himself to the end. He is good socially, to where while he obviously hypes himself up as the golden god in all these confessionals, he isn't really that caricature back on the island. He's a more mellow, relatable guy that people genuinely seem to like on All Stars. And then strategically, again, he plays one of the most dominant games we have seen in Australian Survivor, really running circles around everyone on All Stars, and even his first time around was strategically dominant early on there as well. Now again, I don't think he's up there with the all-time greats in Survivor US, though I do think with Australian Survivor here, I do think he is pretty solidly above Haley to me, where I feel like I have more faith in his overall game ability, his overall strategic thinking, though really outside that, it isn't that big of a difference between the two. Again, I think they're both the most well-rounded players in the history of Australian Survivor, though again, I do end up leaning towards David here. But there we go, I mean, that's my revised top 10 players of all time for Australian Survivor. So obviously I'll be back when the next season eventually comes around. But really until then, obviously just expect more of the same type of videos from this channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.